I've been on the road. I've been doing
Welcome to
shows.
another Coffee with Samso. Today we're at the UWA Club here in Crawley at University of Western Australia. I've got Kado Muir here with us talking about sustainable investing. Kado's been with us previously, must be almost 6 months now, plus.
Yeah, or maybe a year,
And where we had a discussion about what he's been doing. But I know Kado's been very active in this space, and he will probably be the best guy to give us a rundown. Kado, thanks for coming. Look, sustainable investing is been sort of on the lips of everybody in sort of the mineral resource mining industries. Is that a word that's new, or is that sort of a refinement of previous descriptions or narratives of this space? And I know the last, recently, the Juukan incident has brought this to surface to the general public. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
No, good, Noel. First, I should just acknowledge the Whadjuk people, as we're at this beautiful building at UWA, where you and I spent many years going to uni and playing basketball together.
Doing our walkabouts away from the lecture theatre.
Yes. And of course, part of that acknowledgement is that Crawley was an important camping grounds for Whadjuk Noongar people, before contact. And even into the post-contact era, there are photographs of people living and camping along Crawley Point. So some of the earliest photos of Western Australia.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it's a place steeped in the traditional Aboriginal history as well as the contemporary, more modern history as well.
Well, it's a nice spot, though.
It is, yeah. No, it's a beautiful spot. Yeah, so in terms of, I think Juukan Gorge incident, which is basically where Rio Tinto had all the lawful requirements met, but they proceeded to blow up and destroy a Aboriginal site which was found to be archaeologically significant, being 46,000 years old. It was one of the earliest examples of human occupation, human evidence, not only in Australia but for anywhere in the world. Okay. And so it was a site of very, very high importance, both archaeologically speaking but also ethnographically, in terms of the importance to living Aboriginal people today. A couple of the archaeological evidence that came out of that site, one of the first or earliest known sharpened bone tools, tools made of bone in Australia. I think it was a kangaroo teeth bone tool. The other really prominent find at the Juukan Gorge, and these places, when people say Juukan Gorge, and a lot of your audience would be aware of the iron ore industry and how iron ore deposits in the Pilbara essentially removing entire mountain ranges. And Juukan was a rock shelter or a cave named place in one of those ranges that supported an iron ore deposit. And so the process has been, and it's been well established in the Pilbara, of seeking approvals to remove a lot of these ore deposits, which are essentially hills and natural features. And those hills and natural features also have spiritual and cultural and historic archaeological significance to Aboriginal people. One of the big things that's probably just raising in the consciousness, and I think Juukan's done this now, is Australian Aboriginal archaeological sites are some of the earliest known examples of human activity in the world, and a lot of these features, especially a lot of the sites in the Pilbara, actually have world significance in terms of their cultural expressions and the continuity. So 46,000 years in other parts of the world, where you have an archaeological site that's 46,000 years old, the people who created those places have moved on, and the modern populations, even into the prehistory, the populations have moved on. But here in Australia, the populations remain, and there's that living connection between people today and that deep prehistory. One of the best examples of that at Juukan was a human hair belt. So a belt made of human hair, which is quite common. That's part of our cultural and spiritual rituals today, as part of initiation ceremonies and things like that. We make these belts made of human hair. They unearthed one at Juukan which was dated at 4,000 years old in the deposit, and genetic analysis between fibres from that hair, the hair fibres, matched the DNA of people today associated with Juukan. So, you know, there's 4,000 years of deep history there. So that's the sort of significance of Juukan. Now, that's the cultural and the scientific significance. What it has done in investment, mining and political circles is that it's focused very sharply at this unique time in our history in terms of the development of financing and social responsibility and all of those sort of things. So in Western Australia at the moment, they're talking about amending the Aboriginal Heritage Act, and the state government's going through that process at the moment. Probably in a month or two, they're looking at presenting draft legislation to Parliament. The issue with Juukan is that Rio Tinto had applied for and secured all its licenses, all its approvals, what they call Section 18. And what we're finding is how the laws of the state may fall short of human rights standards. And so there's this disjuncture going on between a multinational corporation that seeks finance in, Europe, in the US, to do activities in Australia. And in some respects, the West Australian government and the legal system are beholden or trapped by the needs of these multinational corporations, whether it's Rio Tinto, BHP, which are the two larger ones. And so when we're coming back to corporate social responsibility and ESG, which is environmental, social and governance requirements, a whole new scope of responsibilities open up beyond the immediate legislative requirements within the state that you're working in. And what we're witnessing, I think, Juukan has opened that door open wide in terms of how ESG may apply to Indigenous peoples, and to ensure that the process of resource extraction is not done in ways that are damaging and exploitative, which is, a little bit of an oxymoron in some terms if you're been in the game as long as I have, from having campaigned and been an activist in seeking to hold resource companies to account. But I think we're in a very interesting new space today where even governments are becoming aware that governments are set up to create a stable environment to support economic activities, people to enjoy a way of life, all of those sort of things, which are all interrelated. And the prime driver that's coming out now is that people, and especially in the millennial age, as they become more, with purchasing power, etc., they're looking at wanting to feel good about the products they consume. And if you go through that whole supply chain, one of those things, the big issue in the world today is carbon capture and release, but also the social commitments are things like everything from what your impact is in the communities in which you operate, but it's also about representation on boards, directorships, that sort of stuff, which then flows into governance. So in some ways, I suppose ESG is humanity catching up with corporate-driven priorities, and in that space today, there are opportunities not only for First Nations or Indigenous peoples, but for investors, for companies, to actually look at bringing some of those priorities that people generally seek in the products that they consume. It's interesting looking at this from an Aboriginal perspective, where I have been engaged in direct campaigns and activism, but a lot of my direct campaigns and activism is very simple. It's about ensuring that Aboriginal people get and are able to access an equal benefit from extraction on their lands, that the lands are protected both environmentally and culturally. And I'm quite excited about this new space now where, because my role, while I do my own business, I have a consulting business looking at the ESG space. So I have we've spoke previously about the Sandalwood enterprise, which is grounded in ESG type principles. So I'm quite excited that there is scope here in this new financial space. So what's going on at the moment, I think it's been labelled as carbonomics, and in the carbonomic space there's a flow of money into green capital, in the bonds and direct capital. And we see recently with Shell Corporation, and I think there was a court hearing in The Hague where they're actually forcing Shell to commit to carbon, I can't remember the full details of it, but it's basically a court decision which basically forces Shell to look at its carbon emissions. And you saw then Exxon and another big oil company, which I can't remember right now, having board directors coming onto the board who are focused on the carbon liabilities that they have. So that's all sort of starting to get built into economic models and the way in which capital is flowing. So I think the warning signs for the mining industry in particular, here in Western Australia but elsewhere, is that capital markets are moving in one direction where they're seeking a requirement to make sure that your carbon emissions are under control, or your consumption, or the production of carbon in your supply chain, etc., under control. They're also looking at the social or the sustainability, so ESG, environment, sustainability, social and governance. So the social aspects of the impact that you have. We've been around long enough to know that in the past a lot of this stuff was sort of flippant attitudes around it. But now it's coming home to be actually very, very focused and narrow as to what the requirements might be. And so, in my capacity, both as a consultant, but also as a consultant businessman, but also as a political activist in that sense. So with my hat as the National Native Title Council chair, I'm looking at the landscape in Australia where almost 80% of the Australian landmass, possibly creeping up to 90%, will have some form of Aboriginal consultation, ownership, say, approval checklist. And so if you're accessing land in Australia, you're going to have a systemic view on how you engage effectively with the traditional owners, what the impact of your activities are across multiple levels, whether it's social or even in Western Australia at the moment, the EPA is starting to talk about social surrounds as one of the elements that they're considering in terms of how EPA approves development projects. So I think it's imperative that companies realise that their investors are asking these questions. And I'm actually talking to a lot of fund managers and investors at the moment about what are the most effective frameworks to look at or screen, because what has happened, and there's a confluence of all these things going in, better ways of communication with the new technologies, the emergence of carbonomics, the green bonds, all these sort of things are all coming together. And Western Australia in some respects is probably a great little testing ground for that because of our location geopolitically, all those sort of different things. So there's a great opportunity here to get it right, build systems that are...
The density of activities.
Exactly, yeah, the density of activities. And because, as we know, a lot of the miners based here in Western Australia also go overseas into Africa and other parts of the world. And it would be great if, as part of that, they exported sound principles and values that then can support positive engagements and positive reflections in these other jurisdictions. So that's essentially what's going on. And with my National Native Title Council hat on, I'm looking at across Australia there's this impact of native title determinations, land claims, all of that are accumulating. Aboriginal people have historically been marginalised from participating in the economy effectively, but those tables are turning. So there's opportunities there now in a lot of Aboriginal ranger groups are actually just continuing doing traditional land management practices, which as a byproduct or a consequence is it stores carbon. And so coming back to the Shell experience, they're being forced by their regulators in Europe to capture enormous amounts of carbon, and they need to find places to go, essentially. So here in Australia, we've been a little bit backward in our carbon trading mechanisms and all that sort of stuff. But I know that in Singapore, for instance, they're actually, I think the Singapore Stock Exchange are actually setting up a carbon trading platform. So, there's movements going on in that space. And I think the ASX are looking at trying to, the ASX are competing to try and set up a carbon trading platform here in Australia. So I sort of feel like a little bit rambling a bit, but it's basically there's this whole world of opportunity that's going on. Aboriginal people could well be a centre stage player in that space, but it's just a question of having the opportunity to investigate and learn more about it, and also then to influence the way it develops. So that's where we're at the moment, is all of this is emerging and developing, and there's a great opportunity for everyone, all the players here, to come in at the grassroots level to actually influence the emergence of this new way of doing business. Yeah.
I think when we talk about ESG, and then we had this discussion prior to us starting this recording, was that in 10 years ago there was just lip service, a lot of people talking, maybe a bit more. And then sort of 5 years ago, people were hearing, oh, you know, certain people are doing certain things. This could be the next phase. And now we're in a place where if you're not on the wagon with going along this route, you could severely have issues. I've had stories from clients and things like talking about how the green money is just sitting on the fence because they don't have enough projects to go to where it's completely ESG compliant or strongly ESG compliant. And I think you mentioned, you know, that the whole ESG has brought social into things, whereas it was always environmental. And once you got over the environmental, then we'll deal with the people, we'll deal with the social issues and things like. Whereas now it's part of the equation to have all that in place before they move forward. I think and you're right, you know, in WA we do have a lot of activities. One of the questions, I guess, you know, what we're dealing mineral industry is always about, we use the term heritage issues, heritage surveys and things. So that's effectively the S in the ESG, right? And a bit of the G, I guess. Not so much of the E, right? Now, this has been going pre-Mabo, post-Mabo. What is your thoughts now going forward? You know, taking what we've just discussed in mind, like how is that progressing in terms of, or is that going to all move to the next step where it's all going into another basket?
Yeah. So I've gave a talk early this year at the Responsible Investors Association Australasia Forum, and one of the weak points I noticed in the responsible investment framework is you've got ESG, and there's a danger that you know, if you're doing 50% on E, 10% on S, and 5% on G, that adds up to a good number. And I think a lot of the investors are starting to be alerted that you actually want performance across each one of those tiers, not just in one and accumulating it all into a single index. So with Aboriginal heritage issues, there's a little bit of an esoteric question here, because, give you an example, we're sitting next to the Swan River here, which is a registered Aboriginal site. The Fitzroy River in the West Kimberley is a registered Aboriginal site. And so that's more than just a, bones and stones and charcoal site. It's actually the spiritual and cultural connection people have to this natural feature in the landscape. And so Heritage Act is, heritage approvals and all that are limited by place and, this scope of definition of what heritage site is. Those sort of, and this is the danger for companies and governments who are not aware or responsive, is what they're going to do is they're going to bring in laws that limit the, and it's a balance, I suppose. It's a balance between what you can work with and what the aspirations are. And so activism, shareholder activism, there's going to shareholder meetings and seeking particular resolutions and all that sort of stuff, is a dialogue or a conversation between these interests. What you can actually not so much get away with, but what you can do, as to what the aspirations of the the public expect. And I think that's the narrative. If you follow that, the development of that over time, you see that in the one hand, business and enterprise operated, solely profit-driven. And over time, the profit-driven motives have been reduced. Or not so much reduced, but where do you actually get the profit? In the past, it was just a simple transaction. Today, it's still a transaction, but it's a transaction with values and interests and all of that loaded into it, so that when you go to sell, and we're drinking coffee, if we're drinking coffee that's built around exploitation of farmers, slavery, those sort of things, we'd choose not to buy it. And that's the same sort of conscious consumer sort of thought going into products that are created. And so the traditional Aboriginal heritage tick of approval is not, and this is it's not the final say, and that's what Juukan has demonstrated, is Rio applied the law as it's existed, and what they found is that the public, which is everyone from investors through to Aboriginal people, were saying, no, that's not acceptable. You needed a higher standard. And as a result, senior executives lost their jobs. So that's the sort of consideration. And I think this is where, here in Australia, simple first step is to have a reconciliation action plan. And in a reconciliation action plan, you're looking at addressing and also understanding where reconciliation action plans come from, is that it's a iteration of this movement that was created by Aboriginal people in the 70s, asking for a treaty between the Australian state and the Aboriginal people. That merged into the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation in the 90s, early 2000, and post 2000, Reconciliation Australia was set up with prominent Australians who then went to work with the big corporates around developing reconciliation action plans. And that sort of framework frames an opportunity, and this is one of the things that happened. So Rio actually lost its tick with the reconciliation action plan, so they were taken off the list. I think that's the first starting point. If you can start with a reconciliation action plan, because it identifies things about building relationships with Indigenous people, creating employment opportunities, understanding some of the history, so that awareness, and there's a process of, I think there's about 4 steps that you do in a reconciliation action plan. That's the first step. Then a company needs to start thinking about, okay, if a reconciliation action plan is the first step, what comes after that? And there's scope and opportunities. The Aboriginal people are accumulating capital through a number of structures, whether they're trust structures, etc. And they're starting to build these relationships with investors who are interested in ESG outcomes, social impact, all those sort of impact-based bonds and funds. And so there is an emergence now that we didn't have 10 years ago or 20 years ago, of a whole new era of opportunities that are open to us, built on these historic events, campaigns, activities. So it's an ongoing, I suppose it's just part of being human. It's there's this ongoing process of emergence that occurs, and fortunately, I suppose in the Western world and Australia being part of it, we have a level of stability that doesn't, drop it all down, so we can continue to go on that trajectory.
I mean, when we look at what we've sort of narrated in the past, Congo, the black diamonds and things like that, they're really dealing with social part of the the equation, right? But there wasn't a title to give them, so there's no like you must comply with this and things like that. It was like, and when you come back to a jurisdiction like Australia, and let's face it, we're in a good jurisdiction in terms of generality of our industry. But when we tag ESG on it, it then really gives it a target and saying, you're not ESG compliant. Hence, and we've had, ups and downs, and no one's saying that Australia mining industry is clean as, but now we've got a tag and we can label it. People can then have a bar to try and get at. I think that's the important part. I think that's what you're trying to say, is that let's give something so that we can all work too, whereas it's just fluffy everywhere. Is that a fair comment?
It's the absolute comment, yeah. It's basically saying there are measures that you can put in place. And, there are people who love to count things and, measure the numbers and all that sort of stuff. So it's the marriage of that, the quantum plus the quality, I suppose. And that's because I do have a fund manager at the moment asking me questions about a prominent ASX listed company who self-reports. And what they're asking is, okay, they're saying this thing about their engagement with Aboriginal people. What do the Aboriginal people say? And that hasn't been in the equation in the past because it's self-reporting. But now, because of the way technology and connections are, you can go back to where the mine site is and ask the question of the traditional owners: what is the true nature of the relationship? And I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think there's good stuff happening. It's just that there's got to be a bit more transparency and accountability, and of course the role of government in that. On the one hand, while it creates a stable environment, sometimes you've got to look at where, I think Tim Fisher once said, where the pendulum's swinging in that relationship. So, all this stuff, it's, I fall back on. For here in Australia, we have the comfort and security to be able to engage in these robust conversations in public without threat to personal safety and all that sort of stuff, which would occur in other jurisdictions.
One of the questions I wanted to ask, one of the things I wanted to ask you was your dealings with the fund managers and on the council, and you speak to a wide range of people. It's on the commercial side. How are people, because the talk of the town when things are happening is and you get this in every industry, is you get a few bad apples in the midst and then everything's bad, but no one talks about the way what people want, and then the message from one side gets lost because they just want everything, and whereas the other side, they don't want to give anything. But in reality, it's like people saying geologists just want to knock down trees. But that's true, because we need the trees to sit under when it's hot. And that's what I used to joke with people, right? So what is your thoughts on this kind of where the industry is in terms of this? I mean, it's a very sensitive topic, either way, right? So what's your thoughts on that from the people that you've spoken to?
It's that perennial problem. I mean, we all use metal products. We all, no one loves using a plastic fork or knife.
Yep.
So it's as simple as that.
We can't use plastic in anymore.
No, exactly, yeah. So it comes back to as simple as that. And then, but no one asks, where does that the metal come from?
Yeah.
And that's the difference today, is that people are asking, where does that metal come from? And can they, so it goes back to that whole market-driven, consumerist-based economy where consumption was king. And now it's more conspicuous consumption. And so it's that market. And miners, I'm not defending miners, but miners are out there doing the same job that they've been doing for thousands of years. So this is one of the things your mining fraternity might appreciate, is that Aboriginal people probably have been mining longer than anyone else. Continuously. The Wilgie Mia Aboriginal site is actually a mine site that's over 20,000 years old, that's been continuously mined. Mined for ochre. So it's not that you're at opposite ends of a transaction, because we actually do need these resources. This is the challenge I put to a lot of my colleagues, because I was in part of the anti-nuclear campaign and stuff like that, which I still hold dear, because I don't believe uranium has any place in the environment except in the earth. But a lot of people come in, oh yes, solar's great, solar power. And then you go, well, where do all the minerals come from to actually make solar panels? There's a lot of the green sort of people don't appreciate that. They just think solar panels magically appear somewhere. So it's about that supply chain, and then building in the values, I suppose, in that supply chain. So on the one hand, you have the consumer, and if the consumer is saying yes, eggs, for instance, cage eggs versus free range eggs, you pay $7 for free range eggs and $4 for cage eggs, but people do still buy the free range eggs. So that,
but if you're Asian like us, we only pay $2 for the cage ones.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that's the sort of analogy, I suppose, is you look at that. And so it's where the consumer is, where the source is, and in that supply chain, what are the values that go into it. So investment funds who are generally using, superannuation, other sort of funds to invest, they want a level of performance and a return. But also the people who the fund managers are operating on are starting to ask questions of them. And so that's the sort of environment that we're operating in. And I suppose the challenge is for those mining companies out there. I've seen a few, they start talking about, we've got building in carbon, in our supply chain or in our manufacture, etc. It'd be incumbent on them to also build in the social and which a lot of people are actually doing. So social, as a result of native title agreements, for instance, you're getting more Aboriginal people engaged in working directly on mine sites. And to the extent that in some communities you're exhausted, the people available are not keeping up with the jobs available. So that's a reality, I suppose. We need to come back into the community level to bring people into that space and look at that opportunity. The big fall down, I suppose, in Australia at the moment in the governance framework is both, men named John feature more in Australian stock exchange listed companies than anybody else. So women and diversity in the boardroom. I think the former Treasurer of Western Australia, who also happens to be Indigenous, is now director on two big WA-based companies. And that's essentially a novelty. So it's those sort of things that companies need to be aware of, and they're going to be driven by their investors who are going to start asking for these sort of outcomes. And it's on the CEOs and the C-suite in the companies to actually start setting up the systems to deliver on it. How you do it, I don't know. That's what they get paid the big dollars for. But People like us can talk about it and possibly even advise and support in some way, but that's where the action is.
I think the whole ESG is good for all industries. I mean, we talked about in this venue here about how the 90% of the supply of tin falls into the questionable ESG space, and it's at all-time high now at 30,000 plus. And if you took out the supply of tin in that 90% space, the tin price would go through the roof. Or if you had half of those guys or percentage of guys able to spend money to comply, tin price is going to go up. So it's really have an effect on commodity prices and how we move forward. And I think even if, and on now that in Australia, if the ESG play, or not if, it is already in play, I'm sure that will drive a lot of this efficiencies and productivity in terms of our industry and other industries as well, I think. I think participation comes from maybe something that you mentioned before, that your generation was the one where it's gone into the the Western, whatever you want to call that world, and you're now actually commercialising in that commercial world, and it just takes time, I guess. I don't know.
It takes time. It also, this is where it's important to have these sort of conversations, because you're then sharing the ideas and generating the discussion. So I come back to, self-education also, where you basically, 3 years ago, I didn't know anything about ESG.
So not many people did, let's put it this way.
Yeah. I've gone out there, I've looked at, read, talked, communicated, looked at graphs that I think not many other people have seen, in terms of the trajectory of green capital, which is in the trillions of dollars, and it's just going up like that. So when the airlines start flying again, what's the impact there? So there's a whole range of, it's that, and I find it exciting being able to talk about it and understand it, and then find ways to engage.
Well, it's a perception too, right? It's one side perceives you as one, you perceive the other side as one, but and in most cases the reality is very different to our perception, right? And I think this is the idea of Coffee with Samso, is to initiate discussions and just sharing your thoughts and your views, and what do you think of this? And look, Kate, I really appreciate it. I mean, we could go on forever, and like all these kind of discussions. Really appreciate your time. I do wish hope we can do more of this as we go along. I'll be definitely reaching out to you to speak more. I think this kind of conversation, it should be in mainstream, or at least commonly, so there's a general understanding. I think I'm a geologist. I've been in that industry. I've dealt with heritage issues, and there's good and bads. But I think there needs to be a level of understanding from everybody where it's coming from, right? Not everyone wants to, take you to the cleaners.
Yeah. No, exactly, and it's probably coming to the point where you understand where the other party's coming from. That's the investment that I've put into. Is I love rocks as much as anyone. I've been a prospector since I was 10 years old, so I have that understanding from the other side of the fence. And often, and I find this for a lot of white Australians of a particular age, is that they don't have any understanding on the other side of the fence. They're so caught up in their world, and that's the opportunity for this engagement elsewhere, is to learn new things in your own backyard. And that's the big challenge for a lot of white Australians here in Western Australia and in Australia generally, is that they don't know or understand the Aboriginal history, the Aboriginal culture, the interactions that have occurred in the past, and how that influences people's behaviours today. I personally have gone out of my way to actually understand where a lot of my in terms of engagements or conflict situations where we're having not so much, it's not brutal confrontation, but it's a conflict in terms of priorities on access to land. You go out of your way to find out what are the drivers. And that's where I suppose I've come to the space now where I'm able to sit and confidently talk about the emergence of a whole new economy built around the fact that I started on that journey looking at it from native title Aboriginal heritage perspective and trying to understand what were the priorities driving the mining company executives that we were negotiating with. And so it's about learning, becoming aware, and then applying that.
Well, I mean, that's how we learn, right? I mean, look, guys, I thank Kado for his time and his words of wisdoms. But look, reach out, definitely. I mean, it's a very contentious issue. There's many sides to this, and you can take one or the other. But look, educate ourselves. Reach out to Kado, and I'm sure Kado is happy to explain a few things. Sort of a very new age guy. Yet to have our next game of basketball, but I don't think that's going to happen in the near future.
But the knees won't do it, huh?
Yeah. But look, guys, as I said, I appreciate Kado's words and reach out to him for and I'm sure he will tell you how it is and pose some answers or pose some questions. But Kado, thank you for your time. And until next time.
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. Thank you to your listeners. KadoMuir.com.au.